About 15 years ago, I was in a long lineup during the holiday season, waiting to send a package without cell phone to distract me. And it took about half hour before I got up to the counter, and when I was finally there, the woman who greeted me was rude. And I don't mean just a little bit off, having a bad day, grumpy. She was actually quite hostile. And my first reaction was to call her out on it. But around that time, I was reading a lot about brain plasticity and the fact that we could become more empathic with practice. So instead of escalating the situation, I took a beat and I looked at her in the eye and I asked, "Are you okay?" There was a pause. She was trying to figure out if I was being sarcastic or sincere. And then she burst into tears. She said, "I've been working double shifts for 2 weeks straight. My son's at home with a fever. I think I'm getting sick. It's 3 in the afternoon and I haven't had a lunch break. I'm just flat out exhausted." And I remember reaching across the counter, hold her hands. 10 seconds earlier, I despised this woman. And then I found myself locked in an empathic embrace. Empathy is our superpower. And since then, over the years, I've learned that empathy is actually really good for us. At the moment that we were holding hands, if my brain had been attached to an fMRI machine, the scan would have shown that the pleasure and reward centers of my brain were lit up, just like when somebody's eating a delicious piece of chocolate cake or is high on psychedelics. The reality is that when we're feeling this connection with another person, it's like a high to our brain. And it's actually really good for our bodies too, because all that empathic connection, it actually replaces the stressful hormones like cortisol with the feel-good hormones of serotonin and oxytocin. So what's the problem? Well, we can't empathize when we're feeling overwhelmed. It's true, we can't be in a state of stress and compassion, a state of anxiety and grace at the same time. And the neuroscience about this is crystal clear. But last year, I lived it. So in April, I published my first book and went on a book tour. And it was a dream come true. But after 16 days on the road, I was so flat out tired. And I remember getting onto the train for the last trip home to Montreal, telling myself, 5 hours to go, 5 hours to go, 5 hours to go. And then imagine 20 little kilometers or 15 miles away from the final destination, and the train came to a complete stop. Now, initially, it was like, okay, this is a bit of a bummer, but after an hour, everybody on the train was getting antsy. And finally, a woman who worked for the train came into our compartment to make an announcement. She said, "Sadly, there's been a fatality. Someone has lost their life on the tracks." And you could feel the mood in the train change in an instant. Whatever we were thinking about, how, oh, we're late, this is delayed, was replaced by this sense of collective empathy. But it took 4 hours for the authorities to actually finish their investigation. 4 hours of waiting. So by the time we actually got back on the tracks, headed to Montreal, everybody was back to being irritated and annoyed and frustrated, including me, I hate to admit, which is why I often think about that trip home. How is it possible that the empathy was so palpable and then within a matter of a couple of hours, it just dissipated? But as a researcher, I understand that there are limits to empathy, right? I just said before, we can't empathize. Our brains cannot empathize when we're feeling depleted or overwhelmed or stressed or anxious. So is it any wonder in our culture that empathy is on the decline, right? When we're so busy pushing ourselves to the limits, worried about inflation and the next election and the wars. And how can we expect our children to show more kindness to one another when they're up against things like active shooter drills and eco-anxiety? But what if we could develop a set of skills that would help us in our modern day? A set of skills around self-regulation, a set of skills to flex our empathy muscles, a set of skills to maybe even change the world. I have a PhD in education, and for my own thesis research, I was interested in developing curriculum that would inspire the next generation of leaders and change makers. So I interviewed social entrepreneurs. These are the founders of nonprofit organizations that are doing work to help solve some of the most important environmental and social problems we face in the world today. I wanted to know what they had in common, and I discovered that they have two things. The first is that they have service modeled in their homes, meaning to say that their families take them out volunteering, and they live with this sort of like ethos of giving back to their community. The second thing I discovered that they have in common is that when they saw a group of people who were marginalized or disenfranchised or hurting in some way, they felt compelled to act on empathy. They felt compelled to act on empathy. And that insight of how powerful empathy is as a driver for social change transformed my life and certainly has changed how I show up in the classroom. Now, I've been teaching undergrads, college for over a decade. And regardless of course that I teach, on the first day of class, I always do the same thing. I show them a set of letters, and I give them 60 seconds to unscramble these letters to form a complete sentence. And then I do the big reveal. You are better than you think you are. 8 little words of positive affirmation. Next, I do something that I think is a little unorthodox. I walk around the room, my classroom, and with each and every student, I crouch down to eye level, and one at a time I say, you are better than you think you are. You are better than you think you are. Now, why do I do that? Because Maya Angelou was right. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
Empathy at its foundation includes curiosity. One of the examples I like to share of what empathy looks like in the workplace is here's a fairly normal scenario. A manager walks into somebody's office and says, hey, your numbers are down for the 3rd quarter in a row. We've had this conversation before. If you don't pick up your numbers in the 4th quarter, I don't know what's going to happen. An organization that embodies empathy, that same circumstance sounds different. It says somebody walks into the office and says, hey, your numbers are down for the 3rd quarter in a row. We've had this conversation before. Are you okay? Yeah. What's going on? I'm worried about you. There's the assumption that the person is not the problem, but they have a problem. And if we can give them a safe space for them to tell us what they're going through, personally or professionally, then we can help them. At least we can be there for them to support them. And so, empathy is core to what good leadership looks like. It's seeing people as people and recognizing that we all have personal issues and struggles and insecurities and egos and ambitions and we're just messy balls of human beings. And fundamentally, leadership is not about the results. Leadership is about taking care of the people who are responsible for the results. It's a human job. That's what leadership is.
A sensitive person sees the world through the eyes of love. To me, that's really what empathy is all about. It's compassion, it's understanding, and that's who I want to be. And I don't see that as weakness, I see that as a strength, because if I will choose to be an empathetic person, that means I'm going to be a good listener, and that's going to build healthy relationships, and that's one of the most productive parts of a business. If you can have healthy relationships, and if you as a leader will be a good listener and be empathetic toward people, it's going to build trust. It's going to cut down on misunderstandings. It's going to do away with gossip and prejudice. That's not what you want in the workplace. You want a place of joy, a place of understanding, and if people will see you as an empathetic leader, it will strengthen your hand significantly. Scripture is just filled with all kinds of wonderful advice if we'll just take time to learn from it. And we read in the book of Romans, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. That's one of your responsibilities as a leader, and empathy will help you implement that. As you see people, I like to look at people not just for who they are, but for who they can be. And one of the ways that I'm able to speak into their lives, and you'll be able to speak into their life, is by implementing the gift of empathy. It's a strong point, so see it as that, and it'll make you a better leader. So choose to be empathetic.